wünsche ich. Heute ist Mittwoch, der 26.01. Tag 1021 von Julian Assanges Haft im Hochsicherheitsgefängnis in Belmarsh. Hoffe, euch geht es gut. Was habe ich vor? Ich bin ja gestern auf den Democracy Index gestoßen und habe mal ein bisschen gesucht, und es gibt einen jährlichen Report einer Non-Profit-Organisation namens Freedom House, und jetzt bin ich gerade noch am herausfinden, wie dieses Freedom House operiert, und lese gerade den Wikipedia-Artikel dazu und habe vor, den Bericht von 2021 zu lesen. Der ist etwas länger. Und wenn wir das gelesen und abgeschlossen haben, dann würde ich noch in Freiheit und Kontrolle die Geschichte des nicht zu Ende befreiten Sklaven weiterlesen. Aktuell gibt es gerade im Moment zum Fall Julian Assange nichts zu berichten, nachdem am Montag die Entscheidung gefallen ist, dass dem Berufungsverfahren stattgegeben wird. Wird jetzt auf eine Entscheidung des britischen Supreme Court gewartet, und das kann Monate dauern. Ob der Supreme Court den Fall annimmt, und dann ist die Frage, wann es tatsächlich zu einer Verhandlung kommt. Also da habe ich weiters nichts Konkretes zu vermelden. Democracy Under Siege bei Sarah Ribucci und Amy Slipowitz. Der Titel des Berichts lautet Freedom in the World 2021. Democracy Under Siege. Ich werde den Bericht hier auch auf den Bildschirm werfen. So. Democracy Under Siege bei Sarah Ribucci and Amy Slipowitz. As a lethal pandemic, economic and physical insecurity and violent conflict ravaged the world in 2020, democracy's defenders sustained heavy new losses in their struggle against authoritarian foes, shifting the international balance in favor of tyranny. Incumbent leaders increasingly used force to crush opponents and settle scores, sometimes in the name of public health, while belligerent activists lacking effective international support faced heavy jail sentences, torture or murder in many settings. These withering blows mark the 15th consecutive year of declining global freedom. The countries experiencing deterioration outnumbered those with improvements by the largest margin recorded since the negative trend began in 2006. The long democratic recession is deepening. The impact of the long-term democratic decline has become increasingly global in nature, broad enough to be felt by those living under the cruelest dictatorships as well as by the citizens of long-standing democracies. Nearly 75% of the world's population lived in a country that faced deterioration last year. The ongoing decline has given rise to claims of democracy's inherent inferiority. Proponents of this idea include official Chinese and Russian commentators seeking to strengthen their international influence, while escaping accountability for abuses, as well as anti-democratic actors within democratic states, who see an opportunity to consolidate power. They are both cheering the breakdown of democracy and exacerbating it, pitting themselves against the brave groups and individuals who have set out to reverse the damage. The malign influence of the regime in China, the world's most populous dictatorship, was especially profound in 2020. Beijing ramped up its global disinformation and censorship campaign to counter the fallout from its cover-up of the initial coronavirus outbreak which severely hampered a rapid global response in the pandemic's early days. Its effort also featured increased meddling in the domestic political discourse of foreign democracies, transnational extensions of rights abuses common in mainland China, and the demolition of Hong Kong's liberties and legal autonomy. Meanwhile, the Chinese regime has gained clout in multilateral institutions such as the UN Human Rights Council, which the United States abandoned in 2018 as Beijing pushed a vision of so-called non-interference that allows abuses of democratic principles and human rights standards to go unpunished, while the formation of autocratic alliances is promoted. Bevor ich weiterlese, muss ich noch etwas anderes. Freedom House. The woke imperialism of Freedom House. All pertinent Freedom House Centers staff are accredited with MCOs. Ne? Ich wollte nur schauen, ob es noch etwas gibt zu Freedom House, das mir ein bisschen hilft, das einzuordnen, was ich da lese. Denn ich habe im Wikipedia-Artikel steht, dass Freedom House zu gut 80% von der US-Regierung finanziert wird. Habe ich das richtig in Erinnerung? Freedom House zählt Institutionen der US-Regierung zu seinen größten Geldgebern. Zu den 3 größten Spendern gehörte 2010 der Demokratieförderfonds der Vereinten Nationen. Dazu kommen Mittel weiterer Regierungen sowie verschiedener halböffentlicher und privater Stiftungen, etwa der Open Society Foundations von George Soros. 2016 finanzierte sich Freedom House dem eigenen Finanzreport zufolge zu 86% durch Gelder der US-Regierung. Zu den wichtigen Unterstützern gehörten auch das EU-Menschenrechtsprogramm und die Regierungen von Kanada, den Niederlanden und Norwegen. Google zahlte 2017 mehr als $100.000, Facebook ebenso wie der britische Rüstungskonzern BAE Systems mehr als $50.000. Aufgrund dieser Finanzierungsstruktur wird die Organisation häufig mit dem Vorwurf politischer Parteilichkeit konfrontiert. Danke, das war es, was ich in Erfahrung bringen wollte. Dann ist das aber nicht der Demokratieindex, nachdem ich eigentlich auf der Suche war. Ja, das hat mich sofort stutzig gemacht hier in dem, allein schon auf der ersten Seite. Hat mich die Sprache stutzig gemacht und war ich nicht ganz glücklich damit. Das heißt, wir werden noch einmal kurz schauen, ob ich den Demokratieindex finde, von dem ich gestern gelesen habe und der mich interessiert hat. The Democracy Perception Index is the world's largest annual study on democracy, covering more than 50 countries and representative of more than 75% of the world's population. The DPI is conducted by Latana in collaboration with the Alliance of Democracies to monitor attitudes towards democracy from around the world. Click here to access the 2021 Democracy Perception Index. Okay, das ist aber richtig, ja, Publikation. Das ist richtig, eine Publikation. Gar nicht einfach. Ich möchte noch kurz schauen, ob ich was finde, das ich lesen kann. Oder ist es der Freedom Index, von dem ich gelesen habe gestern? Das ist möglich. Ups. The Index of Freedom in the World is an index of civil liberties published in late 2012 by Canada's Fraser Institute, Germany's Liberals Institute, and the US Cato Institute. The index is the predecessor of the Human Freedom Index, which has been published annually since 2015. The Human Freedom Index presents the state of human freedom in the world based on a broad measure that encompasses personal, civil, and economic freedom. The index presents a broad measure of human freedom understood as the absence of coercive constraint. It uses 79 distinct indicators of personal and economic freedom. The index covers the following area: rule of law, security and safety, movement, religion, association, assembly, civil society, expression, etc. The Human Freedom Index was created in 2015, covering 152 countries. The Human Freedom Index 2016 was published in November 2016, covering 159 countries. Ja. Human Freedom Index. The Human Freedom Index, a global measurement of personal, civil and economic freedom. Stolze 435 Seiten. Findings, da könnte man mal reinschauen, man muss ja nicht den ganzen lesen, ne? Seite 21. Countries by region. Okay, das ist tatsächlich in Zahlen aufgearbeitet und das war's. Ob es da noch irgendwie eine Zusammenfassung gibt, das wäre interessant. Österreich ist auf Platz 21 dieses Rankings von 150 Ländern. 156, glaube ich, stand auf Wikipedia. Jedenfalls durch die extreme Nähe von Freedom House zur amerikanischen Regierung, wenn sie sich zu mehr als 3/4 davon finanzieren lässt, schließt es aus, dass ich den Democracy Index hier lese. Methodology and Sources. Und Notes. Ne. Schade. Bin unzufrieden mit mir, dass ich das nicht finden kann. Ich muss kurz die Heizung ein bisschen runterdrehen, ist der Wahnsinn. Wobei ich irgendwie, jetzt hatte ich gerade erst Covid und ich spüre schon wieder irgendwas schon wieder am Anrücken. The global state of democracy. Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. Institute of Democracy. Idea. Das ist. Ja, schon. The International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance is an intergovernmental organization that works to support and strengthen democratic institutions and processes around the world to develop sustainable, effective, and legitimate democracies. It has regional offices in Europe, Latin America and the Caribbean, Asia and the Pacific, and Africa and West Asia. The organization is headquartered in Stockholm, Sweden. International IDEA is an official United Nations observer. Aha, okay, das hat schon ein bisschen einen anderen Klang. Global State of Democracy Report. The Global State of Democracy 2021, Building Resilience in a Pandemic Era. Okay. Das ist eher was, ja? Sehr gut. Sorry, hat jetzt ein bisschen gedauert. Aber da wollte ich jetzt dranbleiben. Also, wir lesen den Bericht von IDEA, dem Institute of Democracy and... Jetzt habe ich den Bericht weggeklickt. Ne, da ist er. International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. Genau. Forward. The year 2020 has seen the world besieged by a pandemic that has claimed millions of lives. The stability that most of the world enjoyed after the Cold War has perhaps been permanently disrupted, and all nations are struggling to adjust to these abrupt changes. When the new millennium dawned, the 21st century was hailed optimistically as the century of democracy. The future looked bright as many erstwhile authoritarian and hybrid regimes such as Armenia, the Gambia, Malaysia, Myanmar, and Tunisia became democracies. The will of the people as the only legitimate form of authority seemed to be a popular and repeatedly spreading ideal. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the trend of increasing authoritarianism across the globe, with many countries sliding back down the democratic scale. Myanmar, which had been a fledgling democracy just beginning to recover from decades of military rule, fell victim to a military coup, the leaders of which even cited faulty elections as the justification for their course of action. Perhaps the greatest blow to democracy ideals was the fall of the People's Government in Afghanistan, which has seen war being waged for the sake of preserving democratic principles. Significantly, the United States, the bastion of global democracy, fell victim to authoritarian tendencies itself and was knocked down a significant number of steps on the democratic scale. Yeah. Amid such geopolitical upheaval, The pandemic has raged on. Repeated outbreaks in different parts of the world simultaneously have made the disease all the more difficult to fight, and the toll it has taken has been grievous. However, even in this hour of despair, hope remains. Countries across the world have come together to fight this disease, and this has ushered in a period of unprecedented global cooperation. Popular protests for better government in countries like Sudan and Chile have led to important reforms. In Malawi, a landmark decision to annul fraudulent election results set an important precedent, one representing the victory of democratic, independent institutions over government pressure. Successful elections in Montenegro and Bolivia, as well as protests against government corruption in Bulgaria, are further examples of the resilience of democracy. The global urge for democratic governance thus clearly remains strong. However, the pandemic has emboldened several governments to double down on popular expression and push for more direct control. An example of this tendency is Hungary, which passed several ordinances limiting citizens' rights and giving more power to Viktor Orban's government under the pretext of bringing the pandemic under control. In this time of crisis, international ideas, the global state of democracy indices is a vital enterprise. The analysis and accompanying report, based on a robust methodology and a broad, multidimensional understanding of democracy, offers a critical assessment of the global context and seeks to galvanize the countries of the world to strive for better governance. The GSOD legitimizes an expanding purview of democracy. Bereich. The GSOT legitimizes an expanding purview of democracy, which is now no longer limited to just elections and political rights. The report analyzes how countries are faring in terms of upholding democratic principles, including factors such as basic welfare, the absence of corruption, and social group equality. As the former Chief Election Commissioner of my own country, India, I have personally been witness to the changing times of global democracy. Despite India falling in the democracy ranks, I can personally attest that the spirit of democracy among the Indian people remains strong. Difficult times undoubtedly lie ahead. Democracy is on the back foot, and more countries are moving towards authoritarianism than at any other point since 1995. However, I'm confident that democracy's resilience, perhaps its greatest asset, will allow it ultimately to triumph. Dr. Qureshi, former Chief Election Commissioner of India. Preface. 2 years ago, when International IDEA published the second iteration of its Global State of Democracy report, there was a clear sense that the headwinds that democracy was facing all over the world were severe and growing. Nonetheless, it was still relatively simple to point to positive examples that suggested that democracy's remarkable global expansion of the past 70 years had not come to a screeching halt. The number of polities able to hold credible and competitive elections had continued to grow, and countries like Myanmar, Ethiopia, and Sudan, to name a few cases, were still undergoing vulnerable but real processes of political opening. The report made a case for the urgency of leveraging those green offshoots to revive the democratic promise. Little did we know that only a few months later, democracies around the world would be subject to the most severe stress test imaginable. As in many other aspects of life, the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated and magnified pre-existing political trends. while adding a whole new plethora of unprecedented challenges to democracies that were already under pressure. Virtually overnight, all democratic systems found themselves dealing with enormous obstacles to hold minimally adequate elections and secure the functioning of legislative and judicial institutions. More importantly, executives all over the world felt compelled and also tempted to deploy wide-ranging emergency powers to confront the calamity that had befallen the world. Unsurprisingly, the results have been problematic. The 2 years since our last report have not been good for democracy. The monumental human victory achieved when democracy became the predominant form of governance now hangs in the balance like never before. This report documents the myriad signs of this story. It is not simply that the number of democracies has gone down from the peak of 2 years ago, but that some of the worst reversals have happened precisely in places like Myanmar, which had appeared as beacons of hope until recently. Moreover, the quality of democracy continues to travel a very visible downward path across the board. In the context of the pandemic, many democratic governments have adopted questionable restrictions to fundamental freedoms that, in many cases, mimic the practices of authoritarian regimes. Democratic backsliding, namely the sustained and deliberate process of subversion of basic democratic tenets by political actors and governments, is threatening to become a different kind of pandemic. It now afflicts very large and influential democracies that account for a quarter of the world's population. And though all this is happening while authoritarian systems intensify their repressive practices and engage in even more brazen attempts to silence their critics and distort the workings of democracies. The drivers of all these phenomena are complex and in some cases barely understood. This is a story in which democracies are being weakened because the underlying polis, without which no set of democratic institutions is durable, is being rent asunder by different forces, from the polarization nurtured by social media and disinformation to grotesque levels of economic inequality. It is also a tale in which democracies are hollowed out by the citizens' loss of faith in the ability of democratic institutions to respond to social demands and solve problems, as well as by the toxic disease of corruption, which demolishes any semblance of trust. Add to this the credibility-sapping blunders performed by leading democratic powers over the past 2 decades, from the invasion of Iraq to the global financial crisis of 2008-2009, and to the violently contested elections in the United States, and the simultaneous emergence of credible alternative models of governance. And we have the equivalent of a witch's brew for the global health of democracy. The pandemic has simply made that brew thicker and more poisonous. While it is clear that the effects of this global crisis will take many years, if not decades, to sediment, we have accrued sufficient information over the past nearly 2 years to gauge some of the initial consequences and identify many of the dangers and opportunities for democracy that come with them. This is the exercise that readers have before them, a health check of democracy in the age of COVID-19. It is an examination that aspires to be comprehensive, rigorous, nuanced, and constructive. As with our previous reports, this one is based on a comprehensive conceptual framework that unpacks and dissects the many facets of the democratic construct, including the workings of representative institutions, the protection of fundamental rights, the robustness of checks and balances, and the vibrancy of popular participation. 29 attributes and sub-attributes are examined in total, and they are examined in a rigorous manner by resorting to a mass of empirical evidence and encompasses 116 indicators covering 165 countries, with data going back to 1975 for every year until 2020. Indeed, our report is based on our Global State of Democracy Indices, a freely available database updated yearly. This information is complemented by the analytical capacities that come with keeping a close ear to the ground in all major regions of the world, where we operate and deal on a daily basis with the actors that give life to democracy. Our work is not simply desk research. It reflects international ideas' nature as a think and do think. Crucially, we want our analysis to be nuanced, to go beyond the relentless negativity of the most recent headlines about democracy, and lend visibility to the positive happenings, to the promising trends and the successful strugglings happening around the world. In a conscious way, we are trying to avoid the clickbaiting and the ephemeral attraction that often comes with merely gloating about the travails of democracy. We analyze the evidence without fear or favor, going always where it takes us, but with an eye open for the possibilities and the promises. Always predicting a bear market for democracy is easy. It is also inaccurate and unhelpful, and help democracy we must. Hence our insistence in being constructive, namely marrying our analysis with policy recommendations to guide and inspire those working in the trenches of democracy, from election management bodies to legislators, party officials, and civil society organizations. With this report, we hope to convey a sense of urgency about the global plight of democracy, but also of opportunity. We want to use this report, born in the dark days of COVID-19, to press upon our audiences the message that this is the best time for democratic actors to be bold. This is the time to rethink wholesale the connection between citizens and institutions, to experiment with new institutional designs and forms of deliberation, to leverage digital technologies to enhance participation, transparency, and accountability, to place the ability of democratic institutions to respond to citizens' demands at the heart of policy agendas. This is the time to revitalize the democratic project in order to prepare it for the even sterner challenges that lie ahead, including those posed by the climate crisis. If we don't do that now, when the fault lines tearing apart our societies have been laid bare by the pandemic, we will never do it. Democracies will then be doomed to leading a dangerous life where the lure of authoritarianism will only grow. The best way to defend the democratic project is to go on the offense, revitalize it, and make it live up to its promise. In the process of doing that, we should never forget why this work matters. This is about more than safeguarding abstract principles or winning geopolitical battles. It is about protecting the dignity of real human beings, which democracy does better than any other political arrangement. Every democratic reversal is not a geopolitical battle lost. It is a constellation of lives that goes dark. As we are witnessing in Afghanistan today, it is a group of human beings that lose their opportunity to fulfill their potential and dreams, and that is also our loss. This report is our small contribution to this global struggle. It is very small compared to the deeds that are performed on a daily basis by the brave young democracy activists in Myanmar, by the women, that refuse to be cowed by fanatics in Afghanistan, by the citizens that have not withdrawn their umbrellas in Hong Kong, by the jailed opposition leaders in Nicaragua, by the dissidents that are daring to say out loud what the rest of society whispers in Cuba, that no amount of repression can hide, that their absolute rulers are naked and lost. Each of these acts of defiance is a triumph of the human spirit that deserves our homage and recommitment to the democratic project. In these pages is our small tribute and our sincere pledge that we will use the knowledge we gather and the experience we accrue to help reformers improve democracy where it exists, to support those who fight for it where it doesn't exist, and to inspire the million others that need to join this cause if democracy is to endure and prevail. Kevin Cases Zamora, Secretary General, International IDEA. Acknowledgements brauchen wir vielleicht nicht unbedingt. Introduction. Democracy is at risk. Its survival is endangered by a perfect storm of threats, both from within and from a rising tide of authoritarianism. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated these threats through the imposition of states of emergency, the spread of disinformation, and crackdowns on independent media and freedom of expression. The Global State of Democracy 2021 shows that more countries than ever are suffering from democratic erosion, decline in democratic quality, including in established democracies. The number of countries undergoing democratic backsliding, a more severe and deliberate kind of democratic erosion, has never been as high as in the last decade, and includes regional geopolitical and economic powers such as Brazil, India, and the United States. More than a quarter of the world's population now live in democratically backsliding countries, together with those living in outright non-democratic regimes. They make up more than 2/3 of the world's population. Fully fledged authoritarian regimes are also growing in number, and their leaders are acting even more brazenly. The pandemic provides additional tools and justification for repressive tactics and silencing of dissent in countries as diverse as Belarus, Cuba, Myanmar, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. These regimes are das Wort kenne ich nicht. Buoyed. Halt klickig was zusammen, es ist unfassbar. Also, und die Boje is the buoy that make a man afloat, moored in water to mark a location, warn of danger or indicate of navigational channel. Yeah, as a buoy. These regimes are buoyed by a lack of sufficient geopolitical pressures and support from other autocratic powers. Some of them thrive on the narrative that authoritarian governance is more effective for economic prosperity and pandemic management. Worryingly, many democratically elected governments are also adopting time-honored authoritarian tactics, often with popular support. The pandemic has made it easier to justify this behavior, including the politicization of judiciaries, the manipulation of media, restrictions on civil liberties and minority rights, and the weakening of civil society. The pandemic has preyed more on weaker democracies and fragile states, while political systems with strong rule of law and separation of powers have proved more resilient. Yet, the pandemic has also evinced democracy's resilience in key ways. It has fueled pro-democracy movements to challenge this authoritarian tide from Belarus to Myanmar. Protests over climate change and racial inequality have gone global, despite restrictions on assembly in most countries during the pandemic. Many states have adhered to democratic principles during the public health crisis, thanks to transparent and innovative governance. Some studies point to a reinvigoration of democratic values globally, particularly among younger generations. Some governments have provided crucial democratic innovation during the pandemic by accelerating the adoption of new democratic practices, such as digital voting. There are tentative signs of new geopolitical alliances, in which some countries, for example Sweden and recently the USA, are making democracy a foreign policy priority. The Summit for Democracy, the first of which will be held in December 2021, will provide an important opportunity to reassert a multilateral world order based on democratic norms. Many democracies that were seduced into years of complacency during stable times have managed to reform themselves during this crisis. This resilience and revitalizing zeal are more important than ever if democracies are to survive the pressing global challenges ahead. This report offers lessons and recommendations that governments, political and civic actors, and international democracy assistance providers should consider in order to counter the worrying erosion of democracy and instead foster its resilience and deepening. The report documents global trends, but it should be read in conjunction with its accompanying 4 regional reports: Africa and the Middle East, the Americas, Asia, the Pacific, Europe, and 3 thematic papers. The latter explore lessons learned from the pandemic regarding electoral processes, the use of emergency powers, and pandemic-related responses in democracies versus other regime types. The conceptual framework on which this report is based is International IDEA's expansive and inclusive definition of democracy: popular control over public decision-making and decision-makers, and equality between citizens and the exercise of that control. These principles are operationalized through an analysis of 5 core attributes of democracy: representative government, fundamental rights, checks on government, impartial administration, and participatory engagement. Each of these attributes is broken down into multiple sub-attributes. This report does not detail the findings for every sub-attribute. It focuses only on the most important and urgent findings. It closes with a 3-point agenda to harness the energy for democratic reform, which can be used as a framework to unite policymakers, civil society and global leaders, and to exploit democracy's capacity for self-correction. Ich mache kurz Pause, bin in 10 Minuten wieder da. Dann geht's weiter. About the report. Sollte sich nicht während der Lektüre herausstellen, dass es entweder schwer zu verarbeiten ist hier im Stream oder dass es nicht zielführend ist, weiterzulesen, dann breche ich ab. Ansonsten habe ich eigentlich vor, den Bericht zur Gänze zu lesen. Er hat 78 Seiten. Das finde ich jetzt nicht so schlimm. Okay, also bis gleich. So, also, about the report. International Ideas, the Global State of Democracy 2021 reviews the state of democracy around the world over the course of 2020 and 2021 with democratic trends, since 2015 used as a contextual reference. It is based on an analysis of events that have impacted democratic governance globally since the start of the pandemic, based on various data sources, including International Ideas Global Monitor of COVID-19's impact on democracy and human rights, and International Ideas Global State of Democracy indices. The Global Monitor provides monthly data on pandemic measures and their impact on democracy for 165 countries in the world. The GSOD indices provide quantitative data on democratic quality for the same countries, based on 28 aspects of democracy up until the end of 2020. Both data sources are developed around a conceptual framework which defines democracy as based on 5 core attributes: representative government, fundamental rights, checks on government, impartial administration, and participatory engagement. These 5 attributes provide the organizing structure for this report. This report is part of a series on the global state of democracy which complement and cross-reference each other. This report has a global focus, and this is accompanied by 4 regional reports that provide more in-depth analysis of trends and developments in Africa and the Middle East, the Americas, Asia, and the Pacific and Europe. It is also accompanied by 3 thematic papers that allow more in-depth analysis and recommendations on how to manage electoral processes and emergency law responses, and how democracies and non-democracies fared based on lessons learned from the pandemic. Okay. Popular Control and Political Equality. Das sind die 5 wie soll man sagen, Eigenschaften, die in Erwägung gezogen werden. Representative Government, Fundamental Rights, Checks on Government, Impartial Administration, Participatory Engagement. Concepts in the Global State of Democracy 2021. The reports refer to 3 main regime types: democracies, hybrid, and authoritarian regimes. Hybrid and authoritarian regimes are both classified as non-democratic. Democracies, at a minimum, hold competitive elections in which the opposition stands a realistic chance of accessing power. This is not the case in hybrid and authoritarian regimes. However, hybrid regimes tend to have a somewhat more open but still insufficient space for civil society and the media than authoritarian regimes. Democracies can be weak, mid-range performing or high performing, and this status changes from year to year based on a country's annual democracy scores. Democracies in any of these categories can be backsliding, eroding, and/or fragile, capturing changes in democratic performance over time. Backsliding democracies are those that have experienced gradual but significant weakening of checks on government and civil liberties, such as freedom of expression and freedom of association and assembly over time. This is often through international policies and reforms aimed at weakening the rule of law and civic space. Backsliding can affect democracies at any level of performance. Eroding democracies have experienced statistically significant declines in any of the democratic aspects over the past 5 or 10 years. The democracies with the highest levels of erosion tend also to be classified as backsliding. Fragile democracies are those that have experienced an undemocratic interruption at any point since their first transition to democracy. Deepening authoritarianism is a decline in any of the democracy aspects of non-democratic regimes. Chapter 1. Key Facts and Finding. Challenges. The number of countries moving in an authoritarian direction in 2020 outnumbered those going in a democratic direction. The pandemic has prolonged this existing negative trend into a 5-year stretch, the longest such period since the start of the third wave of democratization in the 1970s. Some of the most worrying examples of backsliding are found in some of the world's largest countries: Brazil, India, the United States, and 3 members of the European Union, Hungary, Poland, and Slovenia, which holds the chair of the EU in 2021, have also seen concerning democratic declines. Electoral integrity is increasingly being questioned, often without evidence, even in established democracies. The former US President Donald Trump's baseless allegations during the 2020 US presidential election have had spillover effects, including in Brazil, Mexico, Myanmar, and Peru, among others. Democratically elected governments, including established democracies, are increasingly adopting authoritarian tactics. This democratic backsliding has often enjoyed significant popular support. Authoritarianism is deepening in non-democratic regimes, hybrid and authoritarian regimes. The year 2020 was the worst on record in terms of the number of countries affected by deepening autocratization. The pandemic has thus had a particularly damaging effect on non-democratic countries, further closing their already reduced civic space. The uneven global distribution of COVID-19 vaccines, as well as anti-vaccine views, undermine the uptake of vaccination programs and risk prolonging the health crisis and normalizing restrictions on basic freedoms. Opportunities. Many democracies around the world have proved resilient to the pandemic, introducing or expanding democratic innovations and adapting their practices and institutions in record time. Throughout 2020 and 2021, pro-democracy movements have braved repression in many places, such as Belarus, Cuba, Eswatini, Hong Kong, and Myanmar. Social movements for tackling climate change and fighting racial inequalities have emerged globally and continue to make their voices heard, despite pandemic restrictions. More than 80% of countries have experienced protests during the pandemic, despite restrictions on assembly in almost all countries in the world. There are also signs of the private sector taking on democratic rights issues, such as over the treatment of Uyghurs in China, while forthcoming EU legislation on mandatory human rights, due diligence for private sector companies, may provide an additional push for greater engagement as well. Despite pandemic restrictions on campaigning and media space unfairly favoring incumbent governments in some countries, the electoral component of democracy has shown remarkable resilience. Countries around the world learned to hold elections in exceedingly difficult conditions, and they rapidly activated special voting arrangements to allow citizens to continue exercising their democratic rights. Some countries have continued to make headway in their democratization processes. In Zambia, the opposition leader sailed to victory in August 2021, despite the incumbent party's strong-arm tactics. Recent research shows that authoritarian regimes have not been better than democracies at fighting the pandemic, even without accounting for the lack of data transparency in most non-democracies. To curb rising authoritarianism and reverse this course, international idea calls for a global alliance for the advancement of democracy through a three-point agenda. Deliver. Government institutions, in close consultation with civil society, must take the lead in recrafting social contracts. These contracts should be the result of inclusive societal deliberation that sheds light on the gaps between what people require to meet their aspirations and what governments can currently provide. Specifically, these new social contracts, which will be the basis for immediate recovery and longer-term development efforts, should, at a minimum, address the varied inequalities exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, prioritize corruption eradication, and ensure that environmental sustainability principles are mainstreamed into policy development. Rebuild. Government institutions, political parties, electoral management bodies, and media should reform democratic institutions, processes, and relationships and behaviors so that they are better able to cope with the challenges of the 21st century. They should update practices in established democracies, build democratic capacity in new democracies, and protect electoral integrity, fundamental freedoms and rights, and the checks and balances essential to thriving and resilient democratic systems. They should also prioritize rebuilding the mutual trust between citizens and their representatives that characterizes the strongest democracies. Prevent. Government institutions, along with civil society and the media, must prevent rising authoritarianism and democratic backsliding by investing in democracy education at all levels of schooling, by buttressing the pillars of democracy that ensure accountability, including broad participation and access to information, and by actively learning from other countries' experiences in fighting disinformation, building democratic cultures, and strengthening democratic guardrails. Was ist buttressing? Stütze, okay. Chapter 2. Democracy Health Check. An overview of global trends. 2.1 Challenges. More countries are moving in an authoritarian than in a democratic direction. Since 2016, and for the 5th consecutive year, the number of countries moving towards authoritarianism is approximately 3 times as high as the number moving towards democracy. Although the 2007 and 2008 financial crisis sparked a similar decline, this is the first time since 1975, when our data collection began, that the world has seen 5 consecutive years of this negative trend. Fewer countries than ever are moving towards democracy. Since 2015, the absolute number of democracies has been declining. As of August 2021, the only country likely to retransition to democracy in the period covered by this report is Zambia. There are also countries that have ceased to be democracies in 2020, Côte d'Ivoire, Mali and Serbia, while Myanmar ceased to be a democracy after the military coup in 2021. In Mali and Myanmar, the change in regime type was due to military coups. Number of countries moving in an authoritarian direction or a democratic direction. Aha, über den Zeitraum, seit sie diese Daten sammeln und auswerten. Was war nochmal die Jahreszahl 1975? Ja, this is the first time since 1975 when our data collection began. Ja, hier sieht man deutlich den Zusammenbruch der Sowjetunion und den rasanten Anstieg der Demokratien oder der demokratischen Tendenzen, wenn hier steht Democratic Direction. Ja, interessant, wie große Krisen tatsächlich diesbezüglich diese Veränderungen markieren, wobei es sich hier aufbaut. Ne? Es ist 2010, 2009, 2008, 2007, 2006. Countries moving towards authoritarianism and towards democracy. Ganz konkrete Beispiele. Hundertprozentig sicher bin ich mir nicht, wie ich das lesen soll. Aha, das ist möglicherweise dann also ist die Tendenz sozusagen der Entwicklung hin zum autoritären Regime. Hier haben wir die Demokratie und in der Mitte die hybriden Regime. Aber diese Positionierung dieses Pfeils Bin mir nicht sicher, was das bedeuten soll. Aber das sind prinzipiell 20 Nationen. Die sich in Richtung autoritäres Regime entwickeln. Im Vergleich zu 7, die sich mehr in eine demokratische Richtung entwickeln. Wobei, wenn ich das richtig verstehe und richtig lese, dann haben wir es hier mit Ländern zu tun, die sich von einem demokratischen System mehr hin zu einem Hybridsystem entwickeln. Und hier haben wir es mit Ländern zu tun, die sich von einem Hybridsystem zu einem autoritären System hin entwickeln. Während oben Myanmar das einzige Beispiel ist, das direkt aufgrund eines Militärcoups von einer Demokratie zu einem autoritären Regime wurde. Ich glaube, so ist es richtig zu lesen. Und hier haben wir eine direkte Regimeänderung von autoritär zu demokratisch in Gambia. A number of democratization processes have also been halted or challenged in 2020 and 2021. In Ethiopia, the June 2021 elections were held amid increasing conflict in the Tigray region in a context marked by a fifth of the electorate disenfranchised due to conflict and arrests of opposition politicians. Armenia's conflict with its authoritarian neighbor Azerbaijan in Nagorno-Karabakh and a military rebellion in early 2021 added strain to a fragile democratization process. After longtime ruler Omar al-Bashir was ousted following massive popular protests in Sudan in 2019, a transitional government was put in place. However, Sudan's transition towards democracy has been fraught with challenges, including flare-up of conflict in the Darfur region, accusations of excessive use of police force in the enforcement of COVID restrictions, stalling of the creation of a legislative body, and protests against economic reforms. The second coup attempt in 2021, which took place in October, risks the progress made to date. In Afghanistan, the departure of the US military allowed the Taliban to quickly take over the country. Having ousted the elected leadership, the Taliban's newly announced government is all male and includes many individuals accused of terrorist activities over the last 2 decades. Fragile new democracies have experienced varying reversals. Mali held challenged elections in 2020 when parts of the country were barred from voting due to jihadist insurgencies, and the leader of the opposition was kidnapped a few days before election day. Between 2020 and 2021, 2 coups dimmed the prospects of democratization and free elections. In Myanmar, which has been embarked on a fragile democratization path since 2015, the military used false claims about a rigged election to justify a coup in February 2021, which deposed the government led by Aung San Suu Kyi and her party, the National League for Democracy. The democratic process has also been disrupted in Tunisia in July 2021, the only democratic success story emerging from the Arab Spring, as the president deposed the prime minister and suspended parliament until further notice, invoking emergency powers. More democracies than ever are suffering from democratic erosion. Democratic erosion refers to a loss in democratic quality, as observed through a statistically significant decline on at least one aspect of democracy. In 2020, 43% of democracies had suffered declines in the previous 5 years. Patterns over the previous 10 years were similar, affecting more than half of democracies. number of democracies by year 2015 to 2020. Hier wird also dieser 5-Jahres-Trend grafisch dargestellt. Hier mit einem kleinen Hügel nach oben im Jahr 2008. Wenn ich das richtig lese, waren im Jahr 2015 63% der 165 untersuchten Staaten demokratisch. 2020 sind es noch 59%, aber ich bin mir nicht sicher. Schauen wir mal. The number of countries included in the GSOD indices during this period is 165. The graph shows the number of countries classified as democracies in each year since 2015 and the percentage of countries that number represents. Ja, dann habe ich es richtig gelesen. Also jetzt, im Jahr 2020 gibt es 98 Demokratien. Das sind 59% der 165 untersuchten Staaten. Percentage of democracies which a significant decline on at least one sub-attribute over 5 and 10-year periods. At least one eroding sub-attribute over 5 years, at least one eroding sub-attribute over 10 years. Figure 4 shows the widespread nature of declines among democracies by mapping the increase in the percentage of democracies declining on at least one sub-attribute. However, there is important variation in what democratic erosion looks like in different countries. Some democracies have declined slightly in one area in particular. Canada's decline in the quality of effective parliament, while others have declined deeply and across many areas. Brazil has had significant declines across 8 sub-attributes. The countries that have declined the most, measured in terms of the average across all 16 sub-attributes of democracy, and that were democracies at the start of the decline. The countries that have declined the most in the past 10 years are Turkey, Nicaragua, Serbia, Poland and Brazil. Jetzt kann ich auch die Klammer wieder, nachdem wir den Satz verstanden haben, kann ich die Klammer jetzt auch wieder integrieren in den Satz. The countries that have declined the most, measured in terms of the average across all 16 sub-attributes of democracy and that were democracies at the start of the decline in the past 10 years are Turkey, Nicaragua, Serbia, Poland and Brazil. There are also notable new forms of democratic decline. Until 2020, the most common democratic declines in the world tended to be related to the integrity of elections, media and freedom of expression. Although these aspects of democracy have continued to decline during the pandemic responses that have included travel restrictions, the use of emergency powers that sometimes sidelined parliaments, and the failure to mitigate the disproportionate impact of the virus on minorities and marginalized groups have expanded the scope of democratic deterioration. Democratic decline has broadened to include less commonly seen drops in freedom of movement, predictably enforcement, social group equality, and effective parliament. Backsliding countries are dismantling the core attributes of democratic systems. The number of democratically backsliding countries has never been as high as in the last decade. Since many democratically backsliding countries are large, they represent more than 30% of the world's population. In fact, 70% of the global population now live either in non-democratic regimes or in democratically backsliding countries. The percentage of the world's population living in high-performing democracies is only 9%. These trends have become more acute and worrying with the onset of the pandemic. Over the past 2 years, some countries, particularly Hungary, India, the Philippines, and the USA, have seen a number of democratic attributes affected by measures that amount to democratic violations, that is, measures that were disproportionate, illegal, indefinite, or unconnected to the nature of the emergency. Unlike outright authoritarian regimes or even hybrid regimes, backsliding democracies use parliamentary majorities obtained by initially free and fair elections and high levels of electoral support to gradually dismantle checks on government, freedom of expression, a free media, and minority rights from within the democratic system. This process of democratic backsliding is often gradual, taking an average of 9 years from the onset of backsliding until it ends in either a democratic breakdown or return to democratic health. Explaining the drivers of the democratic decline. The rise of illiberal and populist parties in government in the last decade is a key explanatory factor in democratic backsliding and decline. Periods with such governments in office show a decline on the aspects of elected government, freedom of expression, freedom of association and assembly, and freedom of movement. Democratic backsliding is also linked to increasing levels of societal and political polarization and low levels of support for democracy. Countries with deep political divides and embittered political controversies, as well as low levels of public support for democracy, are more prone to experiencing democratic backsliding. This is then exacerbated by political parties that use hate speech or disseminate false information in their campaigning. Declines in public support for democracy could be linked to governments' perceived inability to respond to social demands and perceptions about poor governmental performance in tackling the effects of economic crisis, corruption, and inequalities, or more adversarial political conflicts undermining the credibility of democratic institutions. Economic crises are also tied to declining support for democracy and democratic backsliding. Lower or negative economic growth rates contribute to the triggering and continuation of democratic backsliding. Mimicking contributes to the spread of democratic deterioration as countries tend to imitate the anti-democratic behavior of others. Hence, when a number of large and influential economic and geopolitical players backslide democratically or propose seemingly effective authoritarian models of governance as an alternative to liberal democracy, this provides models to emulate reducing pressure and incentives for democratization. The struggle to balance freedom of expression, especially through social media, with public safety, as well as the scourge of disinformation, can further democratic declines. As social media firms play a louder and larger role in politics around the world, countries are struggling to effectively and responsibly address a host of issues, including fake and sometimes dangerous news, foreign governments' manipulation of social platforms to influence public opinion, data privacy and security, the firm's monopoly of the market, and the firm's lack of transparency. Map of regime types. 70% of the world's population live in countries that are either non-democratic or democratically backsliding. Only 9% of the world's population live in high-performing democracies. Backsliding democracies. Das sind die linierten Länder hier. Eben auch die USA, Brasilien. Ich denke, die Karte repräsentiert auch die Größe der Bevölkerung, vermutlich. Da steht die hier. This map shows the countries in the world by political regime type. The map has been population weighted to show the size of countries relative to their population size. Okay. Indien. Polen, Ungarn, Philippinen, Europa ist hier, wenn man dieser Karte folgt, ein Hort der high-performing democracy. Mit Ausnahmen. Italien ist a mid-range performing democracy, genauso wie Spanien und Portugal. Achso, okay. Hier geht's weiter. Democratic backsliding can take different forms. Some ethno-nationalist strategies use religion as a political weapon. In example, India, whereas others attack gender equality and LGBTQIA+ rights. For example, Hungary, Poland, Turkey. Currently backsliding countries include some of the largest economies in the world, Brazil, India and the USA, in addition to countries such as Hungary, the Philippines and Poland. Slovenia, which holds the presidency of the EU in 2021, was added to the list of backsliders in 2020. Some of these countries have been backsliding for a long time. Hungary, or began backsliding from a position of relative democratic weakness, the Philippines. The backsliding process may be quicker for weak democracies, but the risk of democratic breakdown is also real for mid-range performing democracies. See the rapid descent of Poland over the last 5 years. Almost a third, 30% of formerly backsliding democracies have turned into hybrid or authoritarian regimes, including Nicaragua, Russia, Turkey and Venezuela. Democratic breakdown in backsliding democracies usually occurs when levels of electoral support diminish and incumbent governments manipulate the electoral process to remain in power. While full democratic breakdown is one possible path for democratic backsliders, those that still enjoy some levels of electoral support can continue to hold free elections and thus have higher levels of representative government, while the liberal aspects of democracy, civil liberties, checks on government, suffer continued losses and become disproportionately lower, so-called illiberal democracies. According to the GCOD indices, there were only 8 countries in the world in 2020 that combined relatively good scores on clean elections with poorer performance in civil liberties and checks on government. Bulgaria, El Salvador, Hungary, India, Mexico, the Philippines, Poland and Sri Lanka. Half of these countries, Hungary, India, the Philippines and Poland, are currently identified as backsliding, while El Salvador and Sri Lanka are at high risk of backsliding and are likely to be classified as such in the new data for 2021 if they continue to experience democratic declines. Non-democratic regimes have become more authoritarian in the last 5 years. The year 2020 represented the worst on record for deepening authoritarianism in non-democratic regimes. The percentage of non-democratic regimes with statistically significant declines on at least one sub-attribute over a 5-year period increased from 21% in 2015 to 45% in 2020, the highest ever. Hybrid regimes have seen declines in a greater number of democratic aspects, particularly during the pandemic, in part because there is little space for further democratic declines in authoritarian regimes, most of which have continued to apply systematic repression during the pandemic. Some hybrid regimes have also used the shield of the pandemic to drop any semblance of democracy and tighten their grip on power without fear of significant international condemnation. Developments in democratically backsliding countries in 2020 and 2021. Brazil was the democracy with the largest number of declining attributes in 2020. The pandemic management has been plagued by corruption scandals and protests, while President Jair Bolsonaro has downplayed the pandemic and given mixed messages. The president has openly tested Brazil's democratic institutions, accusing magistrates of the Superior Electoral Court of preparing to conduct fraudulent activities with regard to the 2022 elections and attacking the media. The president has also declared that he will not obey the rulings of the Supreme Federal Court, which is investigating him for spreading false news regarding the electoral system in the country. In Hungary, human rights groups and the international community barked with the parliament, dominated by Prime Minister Viktor Orban's political party Fidesz, granted the government the right to rule by decree without time limit in order to manage the pandemic, and established prison sentences of up to 5 years for spreading disinformation on the virus. In June 2021, this was replaced with a state of medical emergency, which cannot be lifted by Parliament and is in place until December 2021. Ahead of the 2022 parliamentary elections, a series of new bills, if passed, will favor the party of the incumbent government and put the level of playing field for opposition parties at risk in the next elections. India is the backsliding democracy with the most democratic violations during the pandemic. Violations include harassment, arrests, and prosecution of human rights defenders, activists, journalists, students, academics, and others critical of the government or its policies. Excessive use of force in the enforcement of COVID-19 regulations. Harassment against Muslim minorities. Internet obstructions and lockdowns, particularly in Kashmir. The Philippines has deepened its democratic backsliding during the pandemic through increased militarization of the pandemic response and a crackdown on free media. Several laws concentrate power in the executive to handle the pandemic, including an anti-terrorism law that the government can use to target critics, and a law which criminalizes the spread of disinformation, which fines up to $20,000. Human rights violations have continued and increased during the pandemic, with killings as part of the war on drugs rising dramatically, with almost full impunity and lack of investigation. Furthermore, a number of politically motivated restrictions, legal actions, and prosecutions have taken place in the country, including against activists, journalists, and media outlets. In Poland, incumbent candidate Andrzej Duda, backed by the governing Law and Justice Party, won re-election after heavy criticism for initially trying to bypass Parliament and the National Electoral Commission to move forward with an all-vote by-mail presidential election. Criticism was raised about unconstitutional changes to the electoral law less than 6 months before the election, removal of functions from the National Electoral Commission, and COVID-19 restrictions on campaigning that favored the incumbent party, which controls public broadcasting and which resorted to xenophobic, homophobic and anti-Semitic rhetoric, as well as the misuse of state resources. Since then, restrictive abortion legislation has been passed despite public outcry. Journalists have faced increasing restrictions, and LGBTQIA+ activists have continued to face harassment and arrests through the establishment of LGBT-free zones. The judiciary, already severely weakened in its independence and politicized prior to the pandemic, has continued to face restrictions. The Court of Justice of the European Union issued a judgment in July 2021 that Poland's disciplinary system for judges is in breach of EU law. Slovenia, which holds the presidency of the EU in 2021, has been backsliding since 2020, although declines in checks on government and civil liberties have been recorded since 2016 and 2017. Concerns have been raised by the EU, as well as by local and international non-governmental organizations, NGOs, about harassment and threats towards journalists, defamation lawsuits against media outlets, funding cuts to NGOs, and legislation that has sought to expand surveillance and police powers. Concerns have also been raised about political pressures on the judiciary. However, state institutions, civil society organizations, and opposition parties and the parliament have played an active and key role in calling out and counteracting such efforts. Boah. Ich mache mal für 10 Minuten Pause und muss die Stimme ein bisschen schonen. Das fühlt sich nicht gut an. Bin in 10 Minuten wieder da. So, da bin ich wieder. Ihr erlebt gerade einen Abbau von Fitness innerhalb von kürzester Zeit. Für mich komplett. Irgendwie habe ich das Gefühl, ich werde krank. Naja, wird passen. Wo sind wir stehen geblieben? Das letzte, was wir gelesen haben, war Developments in Democratically Backsliding Countries in 2020 and 2021. Brasilien, Ungarn, Indien, die Philippinen, Polen und Slowenien. Das habe ich immer nur so am Rande mitgekriegt, was da los ist. Aber Moment, ich brauche noch eine Sekunde. So, probieren wir's. Hybrid regimes with the greatest number of sub-attributes registering 5-year democratic declines in 2020 were Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea, Serbia, Tanzania, Turkey and Zambia, although the opposition's victory in the Zambian election in 2021 may reverse these declines. Statistically significant declines on a year-to-year basis are relatively rare, but were noted in Belarus, Central African Republic, Côte d'Ivoire, and Palestine. Violent repression in non-democratic contexts can be seen in Belarus, Cuba, and Myanmar, where the authorities have suppressed pro-democracy movements in 2020 and 2021, often using pandemic restrictions as a justification. In Côte d'Ivoire, arrests of opposition politicians ahead of the 2020 elections were made using their spread of fake news on COVID-19 as a justification. In Nicaragua, President Daniel Ortega has severely repressed opposition candidates, independent journalists and civil society activists ahead of the 2021 elections. In Russia, President Vladimir Putin, after extending his term until 2032 through a flawed constitutional referendum in 2020, has cracked down on dissent, ordering the imprisonment of regime critic Alexei Navalny since early 2021 on politically motivated charges. This follows the Russian authorities' attempt to harm Navalny through poisoning and a ban on all political organizations linked to him, classifying them as extremist. Common to all these cases is a total disregard for human rights, violent repression, and resistance to Western international pressure, often aided by masked or overt support from other autocratic powers such as China and Russia, in the case of Belarus. (2.2) Opportunities for renewal. democratic adaptation and modernization. The pandemic has forced many democratic institutions, such as electoral commissions, political parties, and parliaments, to make more use of digital tools and collaborate more with other agencies, including health authorities. Such reforms, if maintained beyond the pandemic, can help make democratic institutions more agile and responsive to citizen needs, particularly in the electoral arena. The Global State of Democracy 2021 and the accompanying thematic paper on electoral processes contain numerous examples of countries that have adapted and reformed their electoral processes. Table 1 shows the countries adopting various types of special voting arrangements, most of which were in place before the pandemic, but were extended during the pandemic. Table 1. Okay. Und diese Special Voting Arrangements sind Early Voting, Postal Voting, Proxy Voting and Mobile Ballot Box Voting. Note: countries that include an asterisk extend SVAs for COVID-19 patients. Ja, schön, aber da fehlen doch Länder, ne? Oder sind das Länder, wo das eingeführt wurde in diesen Jahren? Das könnte ich auch sein. Wahrscheinlich. The explosion of civic activism. People around the world continue not only to believe in the ideal of democracy, but also to vocally demand it. 85% of the respondents in one recent global poll said that having a democratic system was either fairly good or very good. During the pandemic, civil disobedience and protests have sprung up and grown in many countries, including Belarus, Cuba, Eswatini, Hong Kong, Myanmar, and Thailand. In some cases, these protests have continued even in the face of violent repression. In fact, 82% of countries have experienced protests during the pandemic. The Milk Tea Alliance in Asia, an online multinational protest and solidarity movement for democracy, provides a powerful example of the strength of democratic aspirations among people, in particularly youth, across Asia and beyond. The movement facilitates the sharing of protest tactics among democracy activists across countries such as India, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Thailand. Politically engaged consumers have driven multinational private companies to protest against restrictions on voting rights in the United States, promote voting among their staff, and support the Black Lives Matter movement. Similarly, the public statements by some companies against the treatment of Uyghurs in China and Twitter's blocking of the Chinese embassy account in the USA regarding the same issue, as well as the implicit support given by Twitter to the Milk Tea Alliance, may also indicate a growing engagement by the private sector in democracy and human rights issues. Furthermore, the trial initiated in 2021 against 4 French retail companies accused of concealing crimes against humanity in China's Xinjiang region may act as a deterrent for other companies sourcing clothes from China. The forthcoming EU legislation on mandatory human rights due diligence for private sector companies can also provide an additional push for greater democracy and human rights engagement by this sector. Striding along the democratization path. Some countries continue to take important strides on their democratization paths, despite challenges posed by the pandemic. Zambia held elections in 2021 that were hailed as free and fair, with opposition candidate Hakainde Hichilema winning with a wide margin over incumbent President Edgar Lungu, opening up for democratic regime change through a peaceful transfer of power for the third time in Zambia's history. Sudan had until October 2021 initiated a gradual transition to democracy since 2020, after massive pro-democracy protests triggered the deposition of long-standing ruler Omar al-Bashir, who had ruled the country for 30 years. Deepening autocratization and technology in China. China is an authoritarian regime in which there are no expectations of a right to privacy or control over personal data. Nonetheless, the ways in which the Chinese government has harnessed technological innovations to maintain control over its people are striking, and the ways in which these technological approaches are being adopted abroad are cause for concern. Use of technology for surveillance in China has been closely linked to and aided by the development of the tech industry in the country, with many private companies part of the surveillance complex. Since the Chinese conduct most of their daily activities online, such as banking, shopping, and paying for services, there are millions of data points that can be attached to each citizen, shaping a very detailed profile of every person living in the country. Moreover, millions of cameras are spread throughout the country, while the government deploys some of the most sophisticated facial recognition technologies in existence. That same information can potentially be linked to each person's profile. In addition, non-Chinese companies wanting to operate in the Chinese market are forced to comply with certain regulations, such as storing their data on Chinese soil in order to make sure there are no loopholes in the surveillance system. While no one in China is able to avoid surveillance, the extent of the technological monitoring of individuals and groups is most extreme with regard to the Uyghur minority, who mainly live in Xinjiang province. There, the state has collected extensive biometric data, including DNA, that it has deployed to track people. It has also been reported that the state harnesses its vast array of surveillance cameras across the country to collect data for a facial recognition system that tracks individuals from the Uyghur community as they travel to cities in other parts of China. Other countries have noted the success China has had in maintaining such a high level of surveillance and have begun to adopt the technology for their own domestic use. The international aspects of China's domestic surveillance also include the indirect participation of tech companies based in democracies through the export of both hardware and software that are used in these surveillance programs. Democracy versus authoritarianism. Which one is better for fighting pandemics? A narrative that has gained prominence during the pandemic argues that authoritarian regimes may be more effective in fighting pandemics than democracies. Recent research conducted by McMahon and Tisch debunks this narrative. analyzing the number of deaths from COVID-19 and vaccination coverage across different regime types based on a multivariate regression analysis. The study finds there is no statistical evidence that authoritarian regimes have been better at handling the pandemic than democracies, even accounting for the fact that many non-democratic regimes are not transparent in their data reporting. The quality of democracy matters. Democracies with higher levels of fundamental rights and more impartial administrations have been more effective in curbing the pandemic than those democracies with lower performance, even accounting for other factors such as GDP and public health capacity. Democracies with more competitive processes for electing their executives have higher vaccination rates than other democracies. These findings should encourage leaders and activists in hybrid and backsliding democracies to strengthen democracy, particularly fundamental rights, impartial administration, and competition for executive office, because these efforts can be associated with public health benefits. Oh, da habe ich einen kleinen Teil des Textes davor abgeschnitten. Müssen wir nochmal ein Stück zurück. Striding along the democratization path. Some countries continue to take important strides on their democratization paths, despite challenges posed by the pandemic. Zambia held elections in 2021 that were hailed as free and fair, with opposition candidate Hakainde Hichilema winning with a wide margin over incumbent President Edgar Lungu, opening up for democratic regime change through a peaceful transfer of power for the third time in Zambia's history. Sudan had, until October 2021, initiated a gradual transition to democracy since 2020, after massive pro-democracy protests triggered the deposition of long-standing ruler Omar al-Bashir, who had ruled the country for 30 years. However, a military coup in October 2021 has put the country's democratization path under severe strain. In the following chapters, the analysis narrows in on the GCOD's 5 core attributes: representative government, fundamental rights, checks and government, impartial administration and participatory engagement. Das ist ein sehr schwieriges Wort für mich. Participatory engagement. The analysis offers an explanation of recent trends and developments with key examples from around the world. Chapter 3: Representative Government. The GCOD indices use the representative government attribute to evaluate countries' performance on the conduct of elections, the extent to which political parties are able to operate freely, and the extent to which access to government is decided by elections. This attribute is an aggregate of 4 sub-attributes: clean elections, inclusive suffrage, free political parties, and elected government. 3.1 Clean elections. The GSOD indices clean elections sub-attribute measures the extent to which elections are free, aggregating measures of electoral management body autonomy and capacity, evidence of voting irregularities, government intimidation during elections, and the extent of electoral competition. A total of 10 democracies have experienced declines in clean elections since 2015. Bolivia, Botswana, Brazil, Czechia, Hungary, India, Mauritius, Namibia, Poland, and the USA. In this period, 5 other countries lost their democratic status due to severe declines: Benin, Côte d'Ivoire, Honduras, Serbia, and Turkey. In 2020, for the second time in the last 20 years, the number of democracies with declines in the quality of their electoral processes exceeds those with advances. Of the 27 countries with a decline in their clean elections score from 2015 to 2020, 12 also recorded a significant decline in civil liberties during the same period, particularly in freedom of expression. This worsening electoral environment has been observed in previously mid-range and high-performing democracies, with some democracies borrowing from the authoritarian toolbox. Kenya, a weak democracy, and India, a backsliding democracy, deployed internet shutdowns during election periods, with India topping the world's list of countries that most frequently used such a tactic. In 2020, governmental control of the media space, coupled with restrictions on campaigning, were seen in the backsliding democracies of Poland and Serbia, turning the latter into a hybrid regime as a result. In fact, the supportive infrastructure needed for credible elections, which is shaped by political party pluralism, inclusive suffrage, a vibrant civil society, a free and independent media, respect for civil liberties, institutional checks and balances, and a robust rule of law, has been worsening in recent years. Government control of the media, clampdowns on freedom of expressions, and internet shutdowns have played key roles. Declines in electoral quality affect democracies of all types. This testifies to the fragility of democracy around the world in both new and old democracies. Serbia, which has been backsliding since 2013, finally became a hybrid regime in 2020. Throughout this period, the ruling Serbian Progressive Party has constrained and discredited civil society and enacted restrictions on free media. There were also voting day irregularities, from vote buying to multiple voting. In 2020, parliamentary elections were largely contested with accusations of the misuse of public resources and an uneven playing field. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, claimed that the dominance of the ruling party, including in the media, was a cause of concern, and parts of the opposition boycotted the elections. Disputes about electoral outcomes are on the rise, including in established democracies. A historic turning point came in 2020-2021, when former President Donald Trump questioned the legitimacy of the 2020 election results in the United States. Baseless allegations of electoral fraud and related disinformation undermined fundamental trust in the electoral process, which culminated in the storming of the US Capitol building in January 2021. As of the end of October 2021, a similar argument alleging fraud but providing no evidence was used to justify a bloody military coup in what had been the weak new democracy of Myanmar in February 2021. Peru experienced one of its worst political crises following a divisive presidential election in November 2020. Candidate Keiko Fujimori, who lost the election, rejected the results and claimed that the election was rigged in favor of the winning candidate Pedro Castillo. EMBs have also been subject to increasing attacks, including in mid-range and high-performing democracies that held elections in 2020 and 2021, or in countries due to hold elections. In Mexico and Brazil, presidents have questioned the integrity of the electoral commissions ahead of elections. In Brazil, the president has gone even further, questioning the 25-year-old voting system and alleging that elections might be cancelled unless it is changed. Electoral Management Body. Das sind EMBs. During 2020 and the first half of 2021, protesters questioned election results in Belarus, where the government responded with violent repression. In Kyrgyzstan, election results were annulled in October 2020 following mass protests, and a new vote was held in 2021. In Côte d'Ivoire, the incumbent president won a contested victory in an election marred by violence, an opposition boycott, and allegations of fraud. As a result, the country no longer meets the minimum criteria for democracy and was classified as a hybrid regime in the 2020 GSOD classification. These examples are evidence of a trend that began in 2010, marked by a global increase of electoral boycotts and a decline in the number of countries where all parties accept electoral results. As a result, there has been a global increase in electoral violence. The declines are most noted in Africa, but are also pronounced in Latin America and Asia. While the global decline in electoral quality is no doubt grounded in links to domestic political developments in many countries, the geopolitical dimension also plays a role. Weakened global pressure for democratization driven by Moment, es abklingt. Eine Sekunde bitte. So, nochmal ein Stück zurück. While the global decline in electoral quality is no doubt grounded in links to domestic political developments in many countries, the geopolitical dimension also plays a role. Weakened global pressure for democratization, driven by backsliding in a number of geopolitically powerful countries, and a delegitimization of the democratic model, have undermined democratic norms globally, as well as satisfaction with democracy. In parallel, the growing economic influence of China through both investments and loans in many parts of Africa, Asia, and Latin America may be an important part of this equation. Electoral resilience in the face of the pandemic. Not all the evidence is negative with regards to elections. Despite the increasing pressures that democratic elections face globally, the pandemic offered marked and somewhat surprising proof of their resilience. An initial period of postponed elections after the onset of the pandemic was followed by a period of quick learning and adaptation that allowed many democracies to successfully hold elections. In 2020, during the pandemic, between February and December, 82 out of 162 scheduled elections at all levels were postponed. Out of those postponed, 63 were subsequently held. As figure 14 shows, postponement decreased as countries and EMBs learned to hold elections in challenging conditions. There were some notable challenges. In some cases, postponements were seen to unfairly favor incumbents who had more time to stay in office and/or restore their popularity during the crisis. For incumbents with authoritarian mindsets, holding elections during a legal state of exception provided an opportunity to use health and safety measures to sideline and silence political opponents, civil society, critical media, and human rights advocates. While SVAs became a promising tool for many countries to deal with the challenge of holding elections during the pandemic, they often add significant costs, impose the need to update inadequate legal frameworks, and ignite political controversies around possible risks to electoral integrity. SVAs, das war doch gerade erst. Special Voting Arrangements. Okay. Es ist oft so, dass dann eigentlich ich suche und gleich drunter eigentlich wird es ohnehin erklärt. SVAs. Special Voting Arrangements. SVAs are designed to expand voting opportunities and to facilitate the principle of universal suffrage. They constitute alternatives to casting a ballot in person on election day at a polling station. SVAs make voting more accessible for individuals, and this acquired special relevance during the COVID-19 pandemic. There are 4 types of SVAs as follows: postal voting, early voting, proxy voting, and mobile ballot box voting. Other challenges included difficulty in conducting electoral observation due to travel and movement restrictions and health concerns, along with difficulties in observing new voting methods and procedures put in place to ensure the safety of voters. As a result, a number of organizations conducting election monitoring, including the Organization of American States, the Carter Center, and the OSCE, launched remote and hybrid expert missions with smaller groups of observers on the ground. This has also placed greater importance on local CSOs conducting observation, with international bodies relying on them to complement their work. In addition, voter turnout in most countries has dropped during the pandemic. From the beginning of the pandemic to the end of June 2021, to the end? Voter turnout in most countries has dropped during the pandemic. From the beginning of the pandemic to the end of June 2021, voter turnout declined in 63% of countries. 53 out of 84 countries that held national elections and referendums in comparison with their 2008-2019 average. Nee, das habe ich falsch gelesen. From the beginning of the pandemic to the end of June 2021. Also nicht das Ende der Pandemie. Managing elections during the COVID-19 pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic sparked significant electoral innovations, and many electoral management bodies adapted their logistics, planning, and materials to ensure the health and safety of voters. The Republic of Korea and Mexico provide 2 good examples of this trend. The Republic of Korea was one of the first countries to decide to go ahead with its scheduled election in the early stages of the pandemic. The EMB facilitated early voting, extended home voting provisions to COVID-19 patients in hospitals and those in self-isolation, and instituted safety and hygiene measures in polling stations. Worth highlighting is the use of augmented reality technology, the enhancement of real-world objects through electronic devices for virtual election campaigning. Candidates ran eye-catching campaigns with three-dimensional leaflets and virtual spaces. These measures guaranteed the safety of voters and resulted in an overall turnout of 66%, the highest rate in a parliamentary election since 1992. Mexico went to the polls on 6th of June 2021 to elect 21,000 representatives at all levels. Deemed the largest in Mexico's history because of both the number of positions and the number of voters involved. This election represented a logistical challenge during a pandemic. The National Electoral Institute issued a specific COVID-19 protocol to keep voters safe in the 160,000 plus polling stations established nationwide. Some of the actions undertaken included mandatory use of face masks, signs and marks for keeping social distancing, hand sanitizing upon arriving at polling stations, disinfection of surfaces every 2 hours, allowing voters to bring their own crayon or pen to mark the ballot, and only allowing 2 voters at a time inside the polling station. The turnout for these elections stood at 52.66%, the highest for a midterm election since 1997. EMBs around the world have been able to keep voters safe during the COVID-19 pandemic. This has also been the case during other health emergencies, such as the Ebola epidemic in Liberia in 2014 and the Spanish influenza in 1918 to 1920. This dynamic shows that an epidemic should not be used as an excuse to cancel the holding of elections and deny citizens their right to elect and remove their representatives. Generally speaking, these pandemic years have been marked by examples of electoral resilience. Out of all elections held on time between February 2020 and September 2021, 73% of them were in democracies. Although there was a decrease in voter turnout in the majority of national elections, 31 countries actually saw an increase in voter turnout during the pandemic, 10 with an increase of more than 10%. Key ingredients for successful elections in the context of pandemic-related postponements were trust, multi-party consensus, and inclusive decision-making. In Finland and New Zealand, transparent and inclusive decisions contributed to less controversial changes to timelines and to rules and regulations for proceeding with elections. In the Republic of Korea, well-planned election administration and the adoption of safety measures led to an increase in turnout of over 13% compared with previous elections. New remote and digital practices are likely to last beyond the pandemic, as they also respond to broader societal and demographic changes, including increasing migration flows and voter mobility. Political parties around the world also used innovations to run campaigns and engage with constituents throughout the pandemic. In the United States, parties held virtual party conventions before adopting non-traditional rallies, such as drive-in events and those held at airports. More analysis on the electoral lessons learned from the pandemic for future crises can be found in the GSOD 2021 thematic paper on elections. Political parties under pressure. Many political parties have seen their membership and levels of activism in steady decline over the last few decades due to voter disenchantment, with institutions and a growing perception that governments are failing to address people's social and economic needs. Despite overall improvement in all regions of the world between 1975 and 2020, since 2016 and for the fifth consecutive year, the number of countries with declines in the free political parties sub-attribute exceeds those with improvements. No surprise, given the global rise in democratic backsliding and a rise in authoritarian-leaning movements and parties around the world during that time. Parties have also been challenged in the last several years by new social and protest movements, seemingly more capable of catalyzing society's demands without formal political representation. This is the case, for instance, of the feminist movement in Latin America and the Caribbean, or the Black Lives Matter movement in the USA and beyond. Parties have also updated the way they understand membership, as seen in countries as diverse as France, India and Senegal. The Aam Aadmi Party in India and La République En Marche in France, among many others, have completely eliminated membership fees. Other parties, such as the Democratic Alliance in South Africa, have created a program of online ambassadors to adapt party messages to the online sphere. The programs have engaged a number of party activists with influence on social media to explain party policies and positions online. Perhaps in response to these new movements, many parties have harnessed technology to help them become more inclusive, including applications for crowdfunding and citizen engagement. In India, given the rapid increase in smartphone usage among lower and middle-income voters, the Aam Aadmi Party developed a mobile app that facilitates direct donations. In the USA, candidates have developed apps that help improve contact and engagement with voters, including one where supporters were able to earn points for sharing and liking certain media posts and for inviting friends to join. The pandemic pushed parties even further to innovate in their offline activities, but also to take the party further online. The 2020 elections in the Republic of Korea were a clear example of a traditionally in-person political campaign moving largely online. However, not all countries have been experiencing the shrinking of space for fair multi-party competition. Since 2015, the top advancing countries for free political parties are Armenia, the Gambia, Moldova, Thailand, and Solomon Islands. In Armenia, mass anti-government protests led to the resignation of Prime Minister Serge Sargsyan. Ich glaube auch, dass Serge nicht richtig ist. Sargsyan, who failed to maintain his pledge to refrain from extending his rule. Since then, the electoral playing field is more leveled, and opposition parties have more space to organize and campaign more freely. In the Gambia, the end of President Yahya Jammeh's 22-year rule has been marked by a more vibrant and plural space for political party action, unprecedented in that country. Social benefits of effective representative government. Elections and political parties are key facilitators of social and economic improvement. A number of studies have shown a positive relation between having a representative government and key welfare indicators, ranging from having adequate health care to the prevention of disasters. International IDEA's data shows that democracies perform best compared with non-democracies across all 16 sub-attributes, including those directly related to social and economic well-being, such as access to justice, basic welfare, and social group equality, while democracies also consistently register higher performance on absence of corruption and gender equality as described above. Indeed, representative government in which leaders can be held accountable by voters creates an incentive for democratic governments to invest in people's development and delivery priorities. Kapitel 4, Fundamental Rights. Ich denke, das werde ich jetzt nicht mehr starten, sondern werde jetzt für den Vormittag Schluss machen. Also das war's für heute Vormittag. Ich bin wieder ab 16:30 Uhr online, vorausgesetzt. Mein Zustand bleibt so, wie er ist. Wenn er sich weiter verschlechtert, dann könnte es sein, dass ich den Stream ausfallen lassen muss. Mal schauen. Ist ja ein bisschen Zeit jetzt zum Ausrasten, sozusagen. Melden werde ich mich auf alle Fälle um 16:30 Uhr. Insofern, bis dahin wünsche ich euch alles Gute. Bleibt gesund. Ciao.